A lock scrapes shut in a small jail in Concord, Massachusetts. It is July, 1846. Outside, the evening is warm. Crickets start up in the grass along the mill dam. Inside, a thin man in his late 20s sits on a wooden bench, listening to his own breathing settle. He has just refused to pay a tax, not because he is poor, because he believes the government collecting it is enforcing slavery and an unjust war, and he will not hand it money to do that quietly. He has built a house with his own hands, board by board, on the shore of a pond a mile from here. He has spent more than a year there, alone, by choice, testing something most people never stop to test: how little a person actually needs in order to live well. Tonight, the state of Massachusetts has decided his conscience is worth exactly one night behind bars. He will not spend it wondering how to get out. He will spend it thinking about what a government owes a citizen, and what a citizen owes back. This is not a story about a man who ran from the world. It is a story about a man who looked at it more closely than almost anyone of his century, and paid for it, in small ways and large ones, for the rest of his life. This is the story of Henry David Thoreau. Picture Concord, Massachusetts, on an ordinary morning in the early 1820s. Smoke rising from chimneys in thin, straight lines. A cartwheel creaking somewhere down the road. Fewer than 2,000 people call this town home. A courthouse. A scatter of churches. Fields, worked by families who have worked them for generations. It is a small town. It is not an ordinary one. On April 19th, 1775, farmers from this same soil stood on the North Bridge and fired on British regulars, one of the opening shots of the American Revolution. Older residents in Thoreau's childhood could still point to the exact spot. The town carried that memory the way a person carries a name they never chose and cannot set down. Quiet, standing proof that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary acts of conscience when the moment demanded it. Into this town, on July 12th, 1817, David Henry Thoreau was born. He would later reverse his own name, calling himself Henry David, one of the first small acts of self-authorship in a life that would eventually be built almost entirely out of such acts. He never explained the change in writing. Those who knew him suggest it was simple preference, the same instinct that would later lead him to build his own house and measure his own days on his own terms. His father, John Thoreau, ran a small pencil-making business. Picture the workshop, graphite dust hanging in shafts of afternoon light, catching gold and heavy in the air, the scrape of a grinding wheel. Steady, unhurried. John was not interested in producing pencils cheaply and in bulk. He wanted a better lead, refined by hand, in small batches, tested and retested until the mixture was right. Some biographers have suggested that Henry's later insistence on doing everything with painstaking care, on measuring twice, on refusing shortcuts simply because they were faster, took root in watching his father work at that bench. His mother, Cynthia Dunbar Thoreau, kept a house that was, by most surviving accounts, warm, talkative, and rarely quiet. She took in boarders to help support the family. 4 children filled the rooms: Helen, John, Henry, and Sophia, and the family moved several times within Concord as the pencil business rose and fell with the wider economy. Never wealthy, never destitute, always working. What set young Henry apart, according to those who wrote about knowing him later, was a kind of stillness inside the noise. He was not the loudest child in a loud household. He watched. He noticed the exact morning the river ice let go each spring, the low groan and crack travelling down the Concord River like something waking up after a long sleep. He noticed which birds came back first, and in what order. Where other children saw a walk to the water as simply a walk, Henry, even young, seems to have treated it as something closer to an investigation. The rivers deserve their own attention here, because they were never incidental. Concord sits where the Sudbury and Assabet rivers meet to form the Concord River, which eventually feeds the Merrimack. Growing up beside moving water gave a young boy a constant, quiet reminder that the world did not run on the town's clock. It ran on its own. He would spend much of his adult life on these same waters, in a boat he and his brother built with their own hands. And the geography of his childhood would become, almost without exception, the geography of everything he ever wrote. He did not travel the world for material. He looked harder at the world already in front of him. Concord itself, in these same years, was quietly becoming something unusual in American intellectual life, close enough to Boston and Harvard to draw thinkers who wanted quiet without wanting isolation. Within a few decades, it would hold one of the most significant literary circles the country had produced. Henry Thoreau was born into this town before that reputation existed. He would spend his life helping build it, without ever seeming to want the credit. A tidy origin story would have the boy already showing signs of the philosopher he would become. The honest record resists that. What it actually supports is a boy closely watched by two capable, opinionated parents, raised beside water that moved on its own schedule, attending local schools with reasonable, unremarkable results, in most visible ways, an ordinary child of an ordinary New England town. The difference came from accumulation, not from any single event. A father working with obsessive precision at a small bench, a mother whose house was full of talk, a landscape that rewarded patience, a town with a living memory of ordinary people standing up, literally, with muskets, against an empire. Henry did not choose any of it. He was simply born into it. But by the time he was old enough to walk to the edge of town and look back, something in how he saw the world was already different from his neighbours. And Concord, without any particular ceremony, had begun preparing the ground for the man it would eventually make famous, and who would, in turn, be shaped entirely by what it had given him. In the fall of 1833, at 16, Henry Thoreau entered Harvard College. For a boy from a modest pencil-making family, this was no small thing. Tuition was a real burden even then. The family took on debt. An aunt, Henry seems to have understood from the start that someone else had absorbed a real cost to put him there, and something of that awareness never quite left him. Harvard, in the 1830s, ran on recitation and memorization, a rigid classical program, Greek, Latin, mathematics, moral philosophy delivered largely as doctrine to be absorbed rather than tested. Students were expected to prove they had retained what they were taught, Not that they had thought carefully about whether it was true. For a mind already inclined to question things, this produced friction almost immediately. Henry was, by his professor's own assessment, a solid but unremarkable student. His grades were respectable, nothing more. What made him unusual was his visible impatience with the whole apparatus. Classmates later recalled a young man who read far past the assigned material, who arrived at recitation already having absorbed several related texts the professor had never mentioned, and who then, having done all that extra work, sometimes simply declined to perform the recitation the way it was expected, because he found the exercise itself hollow. One often repeated story, drawn from later classmate reminiscences and impossible to confirm word for word, has a professor explaining that education should develop the mind evenly, like a tree growing branches in every direction, and Henry answering that he would rather one branch grow to its full length, even if the tree looked lopsided to everyone else. The exact wording cannot be verified. It captures something that shows up, provably, again and again in his later writing, a deep suspicion of balance for its own sake, and a stubborn preference for depth over breadth. It was at Harvard that he first encountered, in a formal setting, ideas that would eventually be called transcendentalist. Though the word barely existed yet in wide use, he read Coleridge. He read the English Romantic poets. He met, through coursework and his own restless reading, the notion that truth might be reached through direct intuition and experience of nature, not only through inherited doctrine. These ideas did not take hold of him fully yet. The seeds went into ground that was already inclined to question anything handed to it without proof. He also began, in these years, the one habit that would shape his entire working life more than any other, keeping a journal. The earliest entries are uneven, sometimes formal, sometimes little more than reading notes. The instinct started here, at Harvard. Among the recitations he found so unsatisfying, the institution he found most limiting was, indirectly, the place where he built the single tool that made nearly everything he later wrote possible. There were points, financially, where finishing at Harvard was genuinely uncertain. He left briefly at least once to teach and earn money before returning. That first, brief taste of teaching gave him an early look at how children were disciplined in most schools of the period, often through corporal punishment, standard practice at the time. He appears to have found it troubling even then, years before the issue would resurface and end a job outright. He graduated in 1837, ranked in the middle of his class. Few of his professors that year would likely have guessed which of their graduates might still be read 2 centuries later. He left without a clear profession, without particular distinction, without any obvious sign of the ambition that tends to predict fame. What he carried instead, quietly, not yet fully formed, was a habit of close watching, a discomfort with doing things simply because they were expected, and a growing suspicion that the respectable life being offered to educated young men of his generation might not be worth wanting. He came home to Concord in the summer of 1837 with no fixed plan. What happened next put him in the orbit of a man who was, at that very moment, becoming one of the most talked about thinkers in America. Ralph Waldo Emerson had settled in Concord a few years before Thoreau came home from Harvard, and by 1837 he was already a figure of real national attention. That same year, he delivered a lecture at Harvard, later published, arguing that American thinkers needed to stop imitating European tradition and trust their own direct experience as a source of truth. Contemporary accounts describe the lecture landing almost like a declaration of independence for the American mind, and it placed Emerson at the center of a loose, growing movement that would come to be called transcendentalism. The exact first meeting between Thoreau and Emerson is not perfectly documented. Both lived in the same small town. Their circles overlapped. Emerson's step-grandmother reportedly suggested he meet the promising young man just back from Harvard. What is well documented is what came after. Emerson, some 14 years older and already established, took a real interest in the younger man's mind. He lent him books. He brought him into a wider circle of writers passing through Concord. He offered guidance. Then something more consequential, a place to live. Calling this simply mentor and student misses something. Emerson clearly saw in Thoreau what he valued and, in some ways, envied. A willingness to actually live according to the principles Emerson wrote about so persuasively. Emerson argued, on the page, for self-reliance and direct experience of nature. Thoreau, increasingly, seemed inclined to simply go and do it. That difference would shape both the friendship and, later, tension. Through Emerson, Thoreau entered a genuinely remarkable circle. Margaret Fuller, one of the most important American critics of the period, edited The Dial, the magazine most associated with transcendentalist thought, and would later publish some of Thoreau's earliest writing there. Nathaniel Hawthorne moved to Concord not long after and became, for a time, a neighbour and friend. Bronson Alcott, an educational reformer with famously unconventional and often financially disastrous ideas, was a regular presence, his young daughter, Louisa, tagging along, a girl who would grow up to write Little Women, drawing in part on childhood memories of exactly this world. This was never a formal school reciting one doctrine, transcendentalisme, as these people actually lived it, was closer to a shared set of questions than a shared set of answers. What does a person owe to the institutions around them? The church, the state, the marketplace? When conscience and convention pull in opposite directions, these were live, argued questions, worked out over dinner tables and in the pages of The Dial. Thoreau, still in his early 20s, was now sitting at that table. Popular retellings sometimes flatten this into Thoreau simply illustrating a philosophy Emerson had already worked out. The truth is more interesting than that. Thoreau brought his own instincts, shaped by rivers and a stubborn resistance to second-hand ideas. Where Emerson leaned toward the abstract and the aphoristic, Thoreau increasingly insisted on the concrete, the measured, the physically verified. If Emerson wrote that truth could be found in nature, Thoreau's instinct was to ask what that meant exactly, then go find out with his own hands. In 1841, the relationship became literal. Emerson invited Thoreau to live with his family in exchange for help with household tasks and gardening, giving Thoreau access to a serious library, ongoing conversation, and financial footing during a lean period. He would live there roughly 2 years, an extraordinarily formative stretch, shaping the writer he became about as much as anything from Harvard had. But living inside another man's household, however generous, was never going to satisfy someone with Thoreau's particular temperament for long. It gave him ideas, encouragement, real literary community. It had not yet given him what he seemed to want most, the chance to test those ideas entirely on his own terms. That test was still a few years off. Before it arrived, Henry Thoreau would face a loss that would sit, quietly, underneath nearly everything he ever wrote afterward. After Harvard, Thoreau needed a living, and the obvious path for an educated young man was teaching. He landed a position at the Concord public school almost immediately. It lasted a few weeks. The story comes down to us mainly through Thoreau's own later account and the recollections of people who knew him, and its core details are widely accepted. A school committee member visited his classroom and criticized him for not using corporal punishment to keep order. Standard practice at the time, Thoreau, apparently to make a point rather than out of any belief in the method, caned several students at random that same day, then resigned on the spot. Calculated protest or a moment of frustrated impulse. The record does not fully settle which. What is certain is that a young man quit a stable job rather than keep enforcing a system he found morally wrong. At an age when most would have quietly kept the paycheck, this matters less for the specific incident than for the pattern it starts. By multiple independent accounts, Thoreau was fully capable of succeeding inside conventional institutions. What he could not do was keep participating once he had decided the institution required him to act against his own conscience. Not laziness, not rebellion for its own sake. Teachers who later worked alongside him described someone meticulous and demanding, not undisciplined. The trouble was never capability. It was an unwillingness to separate daily conduct from moral judgment. Even when the separation would have made life a good deal easier, out of work, he spent time in his father's pencil shop, where his attention to precise measurement reportedly led to real improvements. Experiments in grinding graphite that produced a smoother, more consistent lead. This detail is often treated as a footnote. It deserves more weight. Long before Walden Pond, Thoreau had already shown a real capacity for rigorous, hands-on problem-solving, applied not to philosophy, but to a small family business. The same mind that would later measure a pond's depth with painstaking accuracy was, in these years, working out how to refine graphite in a cramped workshop. In 1838, Henry and his older brother John opened their own school, the Concord Academy, first in the family home and later in a rented building. Where the public school position had failed, this one succeeded, largely because the brothers rejected the standard disciplinary model outright. No reliable record shows either brother using corporal punishment. Surviving accounts describe an unusually experiential approach for the period instead. Regular walks outdoors, surveying exercises conducted in the field rather than from a textbook, a working belief that curiosity, properly encouraged, taught better than fear did. Parents in Concord who sent their children generally spoke well of it. The brothers worked well together. This stretch, roughly 1838 through 1841, appears from surviving letters to have been genuinely happy for both. John was, by nearly every account, the easier and more conventionally likable of the two. warmer in company, quicker to laugh. Where Henry could come across to strangers as blunt, John smoothed the edges, and the two complemented each other, running the school and in ordinary life. In the summer of 1839, both brothers fell for the same young woman visiting Concord, Ellen Seval. Both proposed within roughly a year of each other. Both were declined, reportedly over her father's objections to the family's unorthodox religious views. Popular retellings sometimes dress this up as a dramatic rivalry. The better documented version is quieter. Letters from the period show no evidence of lasting resentment between the brothers. If anything, the shared disappointment seems to have been absorbed without damaging what was clearly a close relationship, worth noting given how differently it might have gone. By 1841, financial pressure was straining the academy, a common fate for small private schools of the period, and around the same time John's health had begun showing early. Not yet understood. Signs of decline. The school closed. Henry moved into the Emerson household not long after. For a stretch, it looked as though his working life would remain a string of short-lived ventures, none of them quite fitting, none quite lasting. None of the people around him in 1841 could have known how little time remained in the partnership that had defined this whole chapter of his life. Within a year, an accident involving something as ordinary as a shaving razor would set in motion the single most devastating loss Henry Thoreau would ever face. In late 1841, John Thoreau nicked himself stropping a razor, a small, seemingly ordinary cut on one finger. It should have healed without incident. It did not. The wound turned infected, and in early January 1842, John developed tetanus, a disease with no effective treatment in this period, and a brutally high mortality rate once symptoms fully set in. What followed was, by every surviving account, one of the most agonizing stretches of Henry Thoreau's life. Tetanus produces severe, progressive muscle spasms. John's decline over those days was physically brutal to witness, and family letters describe Henry staying at his brother's side, nursing him personally, even as it became clear there was no real hope of recovery. John Thoreau died on January 11th, 1842, at 26, only months before what would have been his 27th birthday, held in his brother's arms at the moment of death. According to the family's own account, Henry did not attend the funeral. This is well documented, and it is not a small detail to skip past. Within days of his brother's death, Henry began showing symptoms strikingly similar to tetanus himself. A stiffening jaw, other physical signs of grief, so severe that some biographers describe it as a sympathetic or psychosomatic response. His body reproducing the death it had just witnessed at close range. The precise medical explanation is not fully settled. What is clear is that this was not ordinary mourning. For weeks, he was functionally unable to function. It would be unfair to Thoreau's actual character to suggest he processed this loss calmly or philosophically. In keeping with the composed image, many readers later took from Walden, the letters from this period show a man in real, prolonged distress. Emerson, in his own journal, noted concern for Henry's condition during these weeks. Friends who saw him described someone visibly and genuinely altered. A pattern emerges here, one biographers return to often. Thoreau rarely wrote about John directly, and almost never wrote about his death in explicit terms in anything he published. Yet nearly everything he wrote afterward carries traces of the loss, filtered through subjects that, on the surface, have nothing to do with his brother at all. His first book grew out of travel notes from a boating trip he and John had taken together on the Concord and Merrimack rivers the summer before John died. The book is not an elegy in any conventional sense. Long stretches read as pure, natural observation and a philosopher's digressions, but it exists at its foundation, because Henry took a set of ordinary notes from a trip with his brother and spent years turning them into something permanent, as though sustained attention could hold on to what plain memory could not. Something real about how grief worked for Thoreau shows up here, a pattern that would recur whenever he faced pain he could not directly resolve. He did not process it, by most accounts, through open emotional expression to others. He processed it through sustained, disciplined attention, directed outward, toward rivers, seasons, the physical world in exact detail, not avoidance, though it can look like avoidance from a distance. Given the volume and intensity of what followed, it functioned as a genuine method of working through what had happened. The river he and John had rowed together became the place where Henry began working out how to survive without him. He returned to it again and again in the years that followed, and the book that eventually came from it carried the two brothers together through its pages. Long after, only one of them remained to write it. This loss marks a real turning point. Before John's death, Henry's life had a recognizable shape, a partnership with his brother, a shared school, a shared disappointment absorbed together, a future that seemed, at least in outline, fairly settled. After it, that shape was gone, and it did not come back. Whatever version of adult life Henry had been building toward before January of 1842 ended with his brother. What came next? 2 years alone at a pond. The deliberate stripping down of daily life to its essentials would be shaped, at least in part, by a man who had just learned, in the most physical way possible, exactly how little time any of us are guaranteed. By spring 1845, Henry Thoreau had tried on several versions of an adult life: teacher, schoolmaster, pencil maker, live-in helper in another man's household, and none of them had answered the question he seemed to have been circling since Harvard. What did it actually mean to live well? Not comfortably, not respectably, in a way that could be defended, deliberately, on its own terms. Emerson owned a small woodlot on the shore of Walden Pond, 1.5 miles from the centre of Concord. Unremarkable land at the time, cut over forest with young second-growth timber, not the pristine wilderness later imagination sometimes assigns it. Emerson gave Thoreau permission to build there and live, and in late March 1845, construction began, largely by Thoreau's own hands, with help from friends including Alcott and Emerson himself. Popular retellings sometimes stretch this into wilderness survival. The honest record does not support that. Thoreau was not cutting himself off from civilization in any absolute sense. Concord was a short, easy walk away. He took visitors regularly, walked into town often for supplies and company, and by his own account sometimes dined with family and the Emersons during his time at the pond. The experiment was not a test of total isolation. It was something more specific. Whether a person could deliberately simplify material needs and daily obligation enough to have real time and attention left over to examine the life they were actually living. The cabin itself was small, roughly 10 by 15 feet, framed largely from lumber Thoreau salvaged from an old railroad worker's shanty he bought and dismantled, a detail he recorded with evident satisfaction, since it let him build for a fraction of the cost of new material. He tracked every expense down to individual nails, a kind of financial transparency that was itself an argument. He wanted to show, with real numbers rather than abstract philosophy, that a person needed far less money than convention assumed simply to be housed. Picture the pond on a still morning that first summer. Mist lifting slowly off the water, a loon calling somewhere out past the far shore, the knock of a hammer, steady, unhurried, echoing faintly across to the opposite bank where the trees had not yet grown back. He moved into the unfinished cabin on July 4th, 1845, a date later commentators have sometimes read as a deliberate echo of the nation's own Declaration of Independence. Thoreau never explicitly confirmed that reading in his own writing, and the record genuinely leaves it open. What can be said is that the date, chosen deliberately or not, carries that symbolic weight in how the story has been told ever since. Weight that is not entirely unearned, given what he would go on to write about conscience and the state in the very next chapter of his life. The reasoning behind the experiment, in something closer to his own terms, asks more of a listener than the popular shorthand suggests. He wanted to find out what was truly essential, stripped of convention, and to test whether the effort his neighbours spent chasing comfort and status was, in fact, necessary for a meaningful life, or whether it amounted to a kind of collective, largely unexamined mistake, one that consumed most of a person's limited days in exchange for a security that might not be worth its real cost in lived hours. A fair, non-trivial comparison for a modern listener sits right here. The specific conditions of 1845 Massachusetts were obviously different from now, but the underlying question, whether accumulating possessions and chasing conventional success produces a proportional increase in a meaningful life, or mainly consumes the time a person would otherwise spend on reflection and direct experience, feels, if anything, more pressing now than it was in his own century, given how much further the machinery of consumption has developed since. There are real limits to what the experiment actually proved, and a fair telling should name them. Thoreau was a single man with no dependents, building on land donated by a wealthy friend, with a family and social network in Concord that stayed available to him the entire time, a safety net most people attempting anything similar simply do not have. This does not undo his conclusions. It belongs in the story anyway. By the time the cabin was livable, Henry Thoreau had built, for a total cost he calculated at just over $28, a small working house on the shore of a pond, a short walk from the town where he was born. He was 27 years old. What followed, over the next 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, would become the most closely observed stretch of his life, and the raw material for the book that would eventually make him famous, though fame of any kind was still more than a decade away. and largely unrealized before his death. Life at Walden followed a rhythm, disciplined without being rigid. He grew beans, corn, potatoes on a small plot near the cabin, sold the surplus in town, kept records of yield and cost with the same care he had once brought to nails and lumber. Much of his time went to watching. It is easy to mistake for idleness. It was not. He tracked, year after year, the exact dates ice formed and broke on the pond, building an informal calendar of the local world around him. He recorded which flowers opened first each spring, and in what order. Listen for it. A low groan under the surface in late winter, then a crack that runs the length of the pond, like something exhaling after holding its breath all season. He stood on the bank for that sound more than once, notebook in hand, waiting, breath fogging in the cold. Those dated observations have since been used by contemporary ecologists, most notably botanist Richard Primack at Boston University, comparing 19th century flowering times around Concord to today's, part of the documented record of climate change in the region. Thoreau could not have known his notebook would end up as data in a peer-reviewed climate study a century and a half later. He simply kept watching, closely, every year, without fail. Mornings were often kept for what he called his most important work, sitting, thinking, writing, sometimes for hours, in what he described as active stillness rather than idle daydreaming. He considered this deliberately unstructured time genuinely productive, against the grain of a culture, his and arguably ours, that trusts only visible, measurable labour. Picture him at the shore with a weighted line, hand over hand, lowering it into the dark water, counting knots, marking the number in a small book balanced on his knee. He surveyed the pond's depth point by point this way. A careful, technically demanding project, and the resulting depth map later surveys confirmed was remarkably accurate for the tools he had. Solitude, as he actually lived it, was neither absolute nor always comfortable. His own journal entries from these months record real stretches of loneliness, real doubt about whether any of this mattered. He received visitors regularly, walked into Concord often, and did not experience the pond as a strict hermit's exile. The less polished record of his daily pages tells a fuller story than his later, more carefully revised prose sometimes suggests. One encounter from these years matters more than its brevity suggests. In the summer of 1846, walking into Concord to have a shoe mended, Thoreau was stopped by the local tax collector and asked, again, for a poll tax he had refused for years, in protest of a government supporting slavery and, he believed, an unjust war against Mexico. He refused again. He was arrested. He spent one night in the Concord jail. That single night would produce one of the most quietly influential essays of the century, and it would tie his deliberately withdrawn life at the pond directly to the most contested political questions of his era. The tax itself was small and modest. Fixed sum, Thoreau had stopped paying it years earlier, on purpose, over two things he considered morally indefensible: slavery's continued legal existence, and the Mexican-American War, which began in 1846 and which many in his circle viewed as a war fought largely to expand territory into which slavery could spread. The Concord constable who stopped him, Sam Staples, knew him well. This was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. Staples offered the usual choice: pay now or go to jail. Thoreau shows jail. Picture the walk there. The two men, side by side, down a familiar street at dusk. Neither especially rattled, both aware this was, in its own way, a small and orderly piece of theatre. He spent one night in a plain, unremarkable building near the centre of town, and was released the next morning when someone, most likely his aunt, paid the tax without his knowledge, an outcome he reportedly found more irritating than the arrest itself, since it meant his protest had been quietly settled by someone else before he could see it through. A widely repeated story has Emerson visiting the jail and asking, "Henry, why are you here?" and Thoreau answering, "Walden, why are you not here?" It is a good story. No contemporary written record confirms it happened, and the earliest known versions surface only in recollections written down long after both men had died. Most careful biographers treat it as likely invented, a story that captures something true about the gap between the two men, without being a verified transcript of anything either actually said. What is verified, and matters more, is what came after. In 1848, Thoreau delivered a lecture at the Concord Lyceum explaining his reasoning. In 1849, he published an expanded version as an essay, first titled Resistance to Civil Government, later reprinted after his death under the name it carries now, Civil Disobedience. The argument at its centre runs deeper than the popular shorthand of protest peacefully against unjust laws. Thoreau argued that a person's first obligation is to conscience, not to the state, and that when a government makes a citizen an agent of injustice, even indirectly, through taxes that fund it, refusal is not merely a right, but a duty, regardless of whether that refusal changes anything measurable. The point, he was explicit, was never effectiveness. The point was that a person cannot keep their moral footing while quietly financing what they believe is deeply wrong, simply because refusal is inconvenient. The essay changed almost nothing during his lifetime. Small magazine, small readership, no visible effect on policy that he ever saw. The essay's later reach did not arrive until long after he was gone. The later influence is well documented, in a different lane from his other major work, rather than in competition with it. Leo Tolstoy engaged with it directly in his own writing on non-violent resistance. Mahatma Gandhi read Civil Disobedience while shaping his campaign of non-violent resistance in South Africa and later India, and said so himself, crediting it as a direct influence and borrowing part of its framework. Martin Luther King Jr. cited the essay explicitly as part of the intellectual foundation for non-violent resistance to segregation in the United States, and described first encountering it as a student as a genuine turning point in his own thinking. One night, one small jail, a tax bill worth a few dollars. A century later, cited on separate continents by movements against colonial rule and legal segregation. Thoreau died believing, as far as the record shows, that the essay had barely mattered at all. He left the cabin in September 1847. after 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, moving briefly back into the Emerson household while Emerson travelled abroad, then into his family's home in Concord. His own stated reason was practical rather than dramatic. He had, in his words, several more lives to live, and could not spare more time for that one. It took him nearly 7 years to finish the book that grew out of it, correcting a common impression that Walden was dashed off in the moment. A spontaneous diary of pond life. What appeared in 1854 had been drafted and redrafted repeatedly, condensing more than 2 actual years into a single constructed year, moving from spring through winter and back to spring, a literary shape rather than a strict record. Thoreau compressed real events from across years into the frame of one symbolic year, for clear thematic reasons, to build a narrative around natural cycles of renewal. The underlying observations were drawn from his actual journals and were factually grounded. The structure presented to readers was a deliberate literary choice, and he never claimed otherwise. Scholars comparing the published book against his original journals have confirmed the compression is real and intentional. Picture the desk where this happened. Years after the pond itself, papers spread across every surface, the original journal pages beside the draft. Thoreau moving a March observation into an April chapter because the season of the book needed it there more than the season of his actual life had. When Walden, or Life in the Woods, finally appeared in August 1854, the reception was modest, more modest than its later reputation might suggest. Some reviewers praised the precision of the natural observation. Others dismissed him as an eccentric offering, an elaborate justification for laziness. A criticism not entirely without basis, given the support he'd had from Emerson's land and his family throughout. Sales were respectable. Unspectacular. The first printing of 2,000 copies took years to sell through. He died in 1862, 8 years after publication, with a modest regional reputation, respected in his own circle, known, to some degree, more widely, nowhere near the towering status the book would eventually hold. Picture instead the slow way it actually happened. A reader in the 1870s, then the 1890s, then well into the next century, opening the same book under entirely different skies, finding the same argument freshly relevant to whatever their own moment happened to be pushing against. The book endures in the consistent judgment of scholars across generations, because it works on 2 levels that rarely coexist in one text. It is genuinely rigorous natural history, grounded in real, verifiable data collected over years, and it is, at the same time, a sustained argument about how a person should spend their limited days, built not from abstraction, but from one specific, documented, physically lived experiment. Exact costs, exact dates, exact observation, grounding the philosophy in something a listener can actually check. He had no way, in 1854, of knowing that this pattern, quiet reception followed by slow, repeated rediscovery, would become the defining shape of his entire legacy. He kept writing, he kept watching. The years remaining to him, though he had no way of knowing it, were fewer than anyone close to him had reason to expect. In the years after Walden's publication, His daily work turned increasingly toward natural observation, carried out with a rigour that went past what most naturalists of the period, professional or not, were attempting. Picture him before sunrise, breath visible in the cold, recording temperature and water level by lantern light before most of Concord had woken. This work reached beyond his own notebooks. In his final years, he exchanged letters with Spencer Baird, Assistant Secretary at the Smithsonian Institution, who took an interest in his specimens and field observations, a sign that his methods, however unconventional their presentation, were taken seriously by at least part of the wider scientific establishment, not dismissed as literary decoration. He read Darwin's work on the origin of species when it appeared in 1859, and his later journal entries show him actively testing evolutionary ideas against his own accumulated field data from Concord, an early and genuinely serious American engagement with the theory at a time when most readers still treated it as controversy rather than science. He travelled beyond Concord too. 3 trips into the Maine woods between 1846 and 1857 took him into genuinely remote wilderness, guided in part by Penobscot guides whose knowledge he documented with real, specific respect, naming Joe Pollis in particular, a guide whose practical skill in that country Thoreau openly credited as exceeding his own. He made repeated trips to Cape Cod as well, walking long stretches of the outer beach, recording the geology, the shipwrecks, the fishing towns, the raw feel of a coastline shaped entirely by ocean weather. The Maine woods writing shows something worth naming, since it complicates any flattened image of Thoreau as simply a gentle advocate of tame, walkable nature, facing a wilderness considerably more overwhelming than the cultivated woods around Walden. His prose shifts, registers something closer to awe mixed with real unease, a recognition that untouched nature could exceed easy philosophical comfort. He was, in these later years, actively seeking landscapes that tested his earlier conclusions, not simply repeating them. His surveying work deserves mention too, because it grounds all of this in a practical, paying trade rather than leisured contemplation. He surveyed land professionally across central Massachusetts for years, precise, mathematically demanding field work that was, in fact, his steadiest source of income his entire adult life, more reliable than his earnings from writing, which stayed modest until well after his death. By the end of the 1850s, he had built, across more than 2 decades of near-daily observation, one of the most detailed natural records of a single American region produced by anyone of the period. Data that would sit largely unnoticed for over 100 years before climate researchers rediscovered its value as a precise historical baseline. He could not have anticipated that specific use. What he clearly understood, in practice, if not always in stated argument, was that close. Patient attention to the natural world was not a lesser form of intellectual work. It was a discipline in its own right, one he pursued with an intensity that would occupy him until his body, in the years ahead, could no longer keep pace with what the work demanded. Through the 1850s, as sectional tension over slavery deepened across the country, Thoreau's public stance grew more direct, more forceful than the measured tone of his earlier essay on civil disobedience. Concord itself was an active stop on the Underground Railroad, picture a knock at the back door after dark, low voices, a lantern kept turned down. The Thoreau family took part in this work, sheltering people, escaping slavery, on at least one documented occasion in which Henry personally helped arrange safe passage north. Confirmed in his own journal, rather than resting on second-hand legend, he delivered several lectures and essays through this decade, directly addressing slavery, including a pointed condemnation of the Fugitive Slave Act. The 1850 law requiring the return of escaped enslaved people, even from free states, which he argued no moral person could be bound to obey, extending the core logic of civil disobedience into far higher stakes than a modest tax dispute. The most striking turn came in 1859, after John Brown's raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, an armed attempt to spark rebellion against slavery that ended with Brown's capture and execution. While many prominent Northern voices, even committed abolitionists, distanced themselves from Brown's violent methods, Thoreau delivered a public lecture, a plea for Captain John Brown, defending both the man and his character in terms far more forceful than his usual measured public voice. This asks for nuance rather than simple heroism, because it is genuinely complicated. He was defending a man who had led an armed insurrection resulting in real violence and death, a position well outside mainstream anti-slavery opinion at the time. Thoreau's argument was not that violence carried no moral weight. It was that Brown's willingness to act decisively against a moral catastrophe showed an integrity the cautious, gradualist approach of most Northern abolitionists lacked. He delivered this lecture before Brown's execution, while public opinion was still forming, real social risk attached to it, at a moment when his own standing could plausibly have suffered for taking the position by name and in public. By the early 1860s, his physical health had already begun a decline that would prove irreversible. Tuberculosis, likely present as early as his college years, given some evidence in his own medical history, had progressed slowly for most of his adult life before accelerating sharply around 1860. A trip to Minnesota in spring 1861, taken in hope that a change of climate might help. A fairly standard approach for the disease at the time, brought no real improvement. Picture the desk in these final months. Sophia beside him, pen in hand. Waiting, he speaks a sentence. Pause. Revises it aloud before she writes it down. Too weak now to hold the pen himself, but not too weak to keep working. Focused above all on organizing his enormous body of natural observation, understanding that the material had real, lasting value and deserved to survive him in some kind of order. Visitors in these months, close friends and family, consistently describe someone remarkably calm, even cheerful, in the face of his own approaching death. A composure people who witnessed it found genuinely striking when an aunt reportedly asked, in these final weeks, whether he had made his peace with God. He is widely quoted answering that he did not know they had ever quarrelled. The wording cannot be guaranteed exact, but the exchange is attested across multiple independent accounts from people present at the time, considerably more reliable than the earlier Emerson jail story. Henry David Thoreau died on May 6, 1862, in his family's home in Concord. At 44, his last recorded words according to family present in the room, were simply, "Now comes good sailing." Then, moments later, two words with no clear addressee: "Moose." Indian. Those present believed them fragments drifting up from memories of the Maine woods. Not any final statement meant for the room. He was buried first in the Dunbar family plot, later moved to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, on a rise now called Author's Ridge, close to Emerson, Hawthorne, and Louisa May Alcott, the same small circle of Concord minds that had shaped him and been shaped by him across nearly 3 decades. At the time of his death, he was, by any measure available to the people who knew him, a respected but distinctly minor figure in American letters, one well-reviewed, modestly selling book, a handful of essays that had reached a small, sympathetic circle. Nothing in 1862 predicted what followed. Emerson gave the eulogy, and in the years after worked to publish more of Thoreau's writing drawn from the enormous journal he left behind. Material never printed in his lifetime. That slow, deliberate release, spread across decades, steadily built a body of work larger than what existed at his death, reaching new readers as it went. The moments of rediscovery are traceable with real precision. Gandhi's documented engagement with civil disobedience in the early 1900s, the conservation movement's citation of his naturalist writing as foundational, John Muir among those who said so directly, the civil rights movement's engagement with his arguments on conscience and unjust law, King's own explicit acknowledgement among them, the environmental and countercultural movements of the 1960s, rediscovering Walden as a critique of consumer culture that felt, to that generation, freshly urgent, despite being over a century old, and now, in recent decades, his climate and flowering data, used directly by researchers like Richard Primack, studying environmental change in New England, an active contribution to present-day science he could never have anticipated. What connects all of it is this: his writing has lasted not because it offered easy answers, but because it kept asking one demanding question, differently, across a dozen subjects, and each new generation of listeners has found it freshly relevant to whatever they happen to be living through. Are you living by conclusions you have actually tested for yourself, or by habits you inherited and never seriously questioned? He never claimed to have fully answered it, even for himself. His own life, looked at honestly, included real failure, a teaching job abandoned, a business that struggled, a grief severe enough to show up in his body, a wilderness experiment carried out with more support than his own rhetoric sometimes admitted, a body that gave out at 44, decades before he could finish work his own notebooks suggest he still meant to do. What he left instead was a rigorous record of one attempt, made in one place, by one particular, imperfect person, to actually live by a question rather than write about it from a safe distance. The pond is still there, quieter in winter than in summer, ringed now by a state park, instead of the young second-growth woods he knew. On a still morning, the mist still lifts off the water the same way it did in 1845. Somewhere under the surface, in the coldest months, the ice still cracks with that same low, travelling groan, the sound of something exhaling after holding its breath all season. The cabin itself is gone. Its foundation has been found and marked. A small square of stones where a man once counted nails to prove a point about how little a life actually requires. Somewhere near that square of stones, in the right early light, the water still turns, the colour it turned for him, and the trees still hold that same particular quiet just before the birds start. What remains, printed and reprinted and carried into languages he never spoke, is the record he kept of 2 years spent asking, with real seriousness and real personal cost, what a human life actually needs, and what it does not. That question did not end with him. It was never really his alone to answer.